Behind glass in a museum outside Washington hangs a Belgian lace veil made for a teenage princess promised the Austrian throne. The lace survived. The promise did not. Within 8 years of wearing it, Princess Stéphanie of Belgium would lose her husband at Mayerling, where Crown Prince Rudolph was found dead beside 17-year-old Mary Vetsera. The Viennese court would begin treating Stéphanie as part of the failure, even though she had not been at the hunting lodge and had spent months warning that Rudolph was deteriorating. Yet this is more than the story of a woman denied control over her life. It is also the story of what she later denied her own daughter. More than 4 decades after Mayerling, Stéphanie decided to tell her version of events. Her memoir appeared in German in 1935 under a title that summarized the strange future tense in which she had spent much of her life. I was to be empress. Not I became empress. Not my life at the Austrian court. She chose words that preserved a promise without pretending it had been fulfilled. The book created immediate controversy. Austrian authorities moved to seize copies, and publication there was initially obstructed. A French edition followed in 1937. The memoir gave Stéphanie something she had rarely possessed while living inside royal households: the first word about her own experience. But it was also written by an elderly woman, looking back across more than half a century. Her recollections are indispensable without being beyond question. Memory can preserve injuries with remarkable clarity while rearranging the circumstances around them. What emerges from those pages is a woman who understood her life as a series of decisions made in rooms where she was present, but not truly consulted. Her marriage was selected by her parents. Her duties were assigned by the Habsburg court. Her husband's behavior damaged her health, yet information about that damage was withheld from her. When he died, other people shaped the public account before she had absorbed the private catastrophe. This is crown secrets and scandals, where the grandeur of monarchy matters less than the price paid behind it. Stéphanie's life began in palaces and ended in an abbey after the empire she'd been expected to inherit no longer existed. Between those points, she survived a brother's death, a dynastic marriage, public humiliation, widowhood, estrangement, and war. Survival, however, did not automatically free her from the ideas that had formed her. To understand the contradiction, we have to return to Laeken, outside Brussels, where the children of the future King Leopold II were being raised according to a discipline that left little room for tenderness. Stéphanie was born on the 21st of May, 1864, the third child of Leopold and Marie Henriette. Her older sister Louise had arrived 6 years earlier. Between the two girls stood the child who mattered most to the Belgian succession, their brother Leopold, Duke of Brabant. He was the only son and therefore the heir their father expected to continue the dynasty. The royal children lived amid servants, formal lessons, and strict routines. Stéphanie later remembered cold water bathing as part of their upbringing. Such practices were not unusual among families convinced that physical discomfort strengthened character. In her recollection, however, the cold became part of a wider emotional climate. Discipline was reliably available. Affection was less certain. Her parents had married young for dynastic reasons. Marie Henriette, an Austrian archduchess, found relief in horses and riding. Leopold turned increasingly toward politics, money, mistresses, and the ambitions that would eventually make his name inseparable from the Congo. Their paths moved apart, leaving their children inside a household that functioned correctly without feeling secure. The first loss Stéphanie remembered clearly came when her brother fell gravely ill. Leopold had been expected to inherit the Belgian throne. Instead, after months of deteriorating health, he died in January of 1869 at the age of 9. Stéphanie was 4. In her memoir, she described the death as the first event deeply engraved in her memory, particularly the sight of her mother's pain as the boy died in her arms. The consequences reached beyond grief. The death removed the male heir around whom the family's future had been arranged. Leopold II and Marie Henriette would later have another daughter, Clémentine, but no surviving son. The king's disappointment did not remain a private emotion. It influenced how he regarded the daughters who remained and how useful their marriages might become. Stéphanie soon faced danger herself. Before she was 7, she became seriously ill during a typhus outbreak. Doctors struggled to reduce her fever. A treatment involving cold baths, the same practice she associated with childhood discipline, was credited in family memory with helping her recover. She survived, but survival reinforced an expectation, already taking shape around her. Suffering was something to endure quietly until authority declared the danger over. There is a temptation in royal biography to treat such childhood pain as proof that wealth offers no protection from unhappiness. That is true only up to a point. Stéphanie's family possessed medical access, servants, food, property, and security unavailable to most children. Her father's fortune and power gave the household choices ordinary people did not have. Some of that power was being expanded through the Congo Free State, which Leopold eventually controlled as his personal domain. The system imposed there depended on coercion, forced labor, and atrocities committed against African communities. Stéphanie did not design those policies, and a child's loneliness does not make her responsible for her father's colonial crimes. But neither should sympathy for a royal daughter turn the source of her father's wealth into decorative background. Private pain existed beside public brutality, not instead of it. Within the family, Leopold remained distant. Marie Henriette's grief and dissatisfaction made her no more emotionally available. Stéphanie learned to read expectation more easily than affection. She saw how a royal marriage could continue after intimacy had disappeared. She watched her parents perform unity before audiences while living separate emotional lives. By adolescence, she had acquired the qualities such a household rewarded. She could obey, endure, and present the correct appearance. She had also learned that a daughter's future might be discussed as a family resource. What she had not learned was how to distinguish a genuine choice from an instruction presented politely. That distinction became decisive in March of 1880. Crown Prince Rudolph of Austria-Hungary needed a wife. He was the only son of Emperor Franz Joseph and Empress Elizabeth, better known as Sisi, and therefore heir to one of Europe's great dynasties. The search was restricted by religion, rank, and politics. A bride had to be Catholic, suitably royal, and acceptable to both imperial parents. Stéphanie was 15 when Rudolph visited Brussels. He was 21 and had already experienced a degree of independence she could barely imagine. He held military rank, maintained his own household, and possessed a private life about which the Belgian princess was told very little. He was not overwhelmed by romantic attachment, but he considered her eligible. Under pressure to marry, that was enough. The day after the formal discussions, Stephanie's parents called her into their presence. Her father told her that the Crown Prince of Austria-Hungary had come to ask for her hand. He and her mother approved. Their daughter, he said, had been chosen to become Empress of Austria and Queen of Hungary. Then he told her to think about it and give them an answer the next day. On the surface, she had been offered time. In reality, every word before the deadline had defined the acceptable response. Her father supported the marriage. Her mother described becoming Austrian as a great future. The proposed husband was heir to an empire. Refusal would mean opposing both parents, embarrassing two courts, and disrupting negotiations already treated as a triumph. What could a 15-year-old princess reasonably have understood about such a decision? She could imagine uniforms, ceremonies, and a future crown. She could not know the habits of the man she was being asked to marry, or the emotional atmosphere of the Viennese court. She could not test the promises being made to her. She was being asked to consent to an entire adult life before she had been allowed to live one. Stéphanie spent the night speaking with her governess and her mother. By morning, she agreed. Years later, she would describe the choice as the acceptance of chains whose weight she had not understood. That judgment came with hindsight, but the imbalance was present from the beginning. Rudolph could evaluate potential brides. Stéphanie was expected to recognize selection as an honor. Empress Elizabeth was not enthusiastic. The Belgian monarchy dated only from 1831, making it young beside the ancient Habsburg dynasty. Franz Joseph reportedly referred to Leopold II's commercial interests with contempt, calling him a grocer. Stéphanie was royal, Catholic, and connected to the Habsburgs through her mother, but some in Vienna still viewed the match as socially inferior. Rudolph's private behavior provided another warning. Accounts indicate that he traveled to Brussels, accompanied by a current mistress within his larger entourage. Stéphanie was not given a full explanation before the engagement became public. Once the courts announced the match, withdrawal would have caused a diplomatic scandal. Information reached the girl only after it could no longer easily change the outcome. The formal engagement lasted more than a year because Stéphanie was considered too young to marry immediately. During that period, she was trained for her future position and presented as the princess who would one day stand beside an emperor. Belgium celebrated the match as evidence of international prestige. Her parents had placed a daughter inside one of Europe's most powerful houses. When the time came to leave Brussels, the promise became physical. A special train carried Stéphanie away from her family toward Vienna. She later remembered crying as the journey began and being reprimanded for showing too much emotion before attendance. Even at the moment of departure, feeling had to be managed according to appearance. The wedding took place on the 10th of May, 1881, at the Augustinian Church in Vienna, only days before Stéphanie's 17th birthday. European royalty, diplomats, and members of the imperial family filled the church. Bells rang across the city. Military bands played the anthems of Austria and Belgium. The teenage bride became Crown Princess of Austria-Hungary. She wore an elaborate Belgian point de gaze lace veil. It displayed the skill of the country she was leaving, and it was a visible promise of what the marriage was supposed to accomplish. The veil joined Belgian craftsmanship to Habsburg ceremony. To the crowds, it belonged to a future empress. The public celebration could not prepare Stéphanie for the private marriage. She later wrote about the wedding night in language of fear, ignorance, and disillusionment. The surviving evidence cannot reconstruct every intimate detail with certainty, and her strongest descriptions came many years afterward. What remains clear is that she believed she had been sent to the altar without the knowledge required to understand what marriage would demand of her. That does not mean every early moment between Stéphanie and Rudolph was hostile. Other accounts suggest a period of mutual attachment and relative harmony. Dynastic marriages could contain affection without having begun as love matches. Rudolph and Stéphanie were young, closely watched, and expected to transform a political arrangement into a functioning partnership before an audience. A visit to Hungary shortly after the wedding briefly gave Stéphanie the warmth she had hoped Vienna might provide. Crowds greeted her enthusiastically, and Belgian colors appeared along the route. For a young woman who had left home in tears, hearing her national anthem in another country must have carried emotional force. The gamble did not yet look entirely lost, but becoming crown princess did not mean learning gradually. Stéphanie entered a court governed by elaborate rules and old judgments. Her German remained imperfect. She did not know every family rivalry, ceremonial expectation, or aristocratic name. Yet errors made by the Belgian newcomer would be noticed immediately. Empress Elizabeth had spent years resisting the demands of court. Sisi disliked prolonged ceremony, rigid schedules, and the constant observation attached to her position. She traveled extensively, rode compulsively, and sought distance from Vienna. Her absence has often been romanticized as rebellion against an oppressive institution. For Stéphanie, those absences had a practical consequence. According to her memoir, many ceremonial obligations fell upon the young daughter-in-law. She attended receptions, dinners, and official functions while still learning how the court operated. The woman promised future power found herself performing duties the existing empress preferred to avoid. It would be too simple to turn this into a contest between a cruel mother-in-law and an innocent bride. Elizabeth had entered the same court as a teenager and suffered under its expectations. She understood the loneliness of a dynastic marriage, but shared experience does not guarantee sympathy. Sisi's own need to escape left Stéphanie carrying responsibilities for which she felt unprepared. The two women also differed. Elizabeth sought freedom through distance, movement, and refusal. Stéphanie tried to succeed through correctness. She learned names, languages, and seating arrangements. She stood through formal events and built the competence expected of a crown princess. What felt like imprisonment to one woman became required work for the other. From the outside, the arrangement looked successful. Rudolph appeared handsome, intelligent, and modern. He held liberal political ideas that attracted those frustrated with his conservative father. Stéphanie was young, dignified, and increasingly capable in public. Engravings and photographs offered the image of a secure imperial future. The marriage gained new hope when Stéphanie became pregnant. Rudolph grew more attentive, and the court prepared for the next generation. Both parents expected or hoped for a boy. A son would eventually stand behind Rudolph in the line of succession and confirm that the dynastic plan had worked. On the 2nd of September, 1883, Stéphanie gave birth at Luxembourg to a daughter, Elizabeth Marie. Within the family, the child would be known as Erzsi. Franz Josef welcomed his granddaughter warmly. Rudolph initially failed to conceal his disappointment that the baby was not the male heir the empire expected, although his correspondence indicates that he later took an active interest in her. For Stéphanie, motherhood offered a role that was both assigned and emotionally real. She had been married to produce the next generation, but Elizabeth was not simply a dynastic result. She became the most personal relationship in Stéphanie's Viennese life. Accounts describe the young mother spending time with her child rather than surrendering every intimate task to nurses. The birth did not heal the marriage. It briefly gave Rudolph and Stéphanie a common purpose, then exposed the pressure already surrounding them. A daughter was celebrated, but she did not resolve the demand for a male heir. Stéphanie's usefulness to the dynasty was still being measured against a child she had not produced. The public couple continued to appear together. They attended the opera, reviews, charities, and court events. Their position required coordinated appearances, even as their private lives began separating. The photographs captured clothing, posture, and rank. They could not capture absence. Rudolph spent increasing amounts of time away. He hunted, traveled, and pursued other women. He also lived under a different form of constraint. As heir, he was expected to wait for authority, while his father retained complete control. Rudolph possessed political ideas but little power to implement them. He secretly supplied articles to sympathetic newspapers, criticizing aspects of the system he would supposedly inherit. His frustrations do not excuse his treatment of Stéphanie. They do, however, help explain the division inside him. Publicly, he represented continuity. Privately, he criticized the emperor's policies and resented the limits of his role. He had rank without present authority, just as Stéphanie had title without meaningful control. The marriage suffered its most intimate betrayal when Rudolph contracted a venereal disease through his extramarital life and transmitted it to his wife. The exact infection is not consistently identified across later accounts, so certainty about the diagnosis should be avoided. The consequence reported by numerous biographers is less disputed. Stéphanie became unable to have another child. She was not yet 22. Court physicians did not initially tell her plainly what had happened. Euphemism and secrecy surrounded the illness. A wife in her position was expected to understand enough to protect the dynasty from scandal while remaining silent about the husband whose behavior had harmed her. Her body carried the consequence of information other people managed. The injury was personal, marital, and political at once. Stéphanie had lost the possibility of another pregnancy. The court had lost the chance of receiving a male heir through Rudolph. Her husband continued the affairs that had helped create the condition. If the dynasty regarded her infertility as a failure, it was a failure produced by the man it was designed to protect. From this point, reconciliation became increasingly unlikely. Stéphanie refused to continue conjugal life as before. Rudolph remained away and pursued other relationships. Some biographers also associate Stéphanie with Polish Count Artur Potocki during the later years of the marriage. Whatever the exact boundaries of that attachment, the marriage had ceased to operate as an intimate partnership long before Mayerling. Rudolph's political and psychological condition also worsened. Accounts from those around him describe periods of depression, anger, and instability. He drank heavily and used morphine. He spoke about death in ways that alarmed people close to him. None of those factors alone explains what would happen. Together, they formed a pattern that was becoming more difficult to hide. The court still needed him to appear functional. Franz Josef treated his son as an heir to be managed rather than as a political partner. Rudolph could write radical ideas anonymously, but he could not openly redirect imperial policy. Every year that his father remained healthy extended the wait for a throne Rudolph increasingly seemed unfit to occupy. In the autumn of 1888, Stéphanie saw him after a period apart and was shocked by the change. In her memoir, she described loose skin, restless eyes, and an expression that seemed to have lost its internal strength. Her words were written later, but they reflect a judgment she insisted she made before the catastrophe. Rudolph was visibly disintegrating. She went to Franz Josef. This was more than a wife complaining about an unhappy marriage. Stéphanie warned the one person with authority over Rudolph that his condition had become dangerous. According to her account, the emperor did not accept the seriousness of what she described. He treated his son as fundamentally well, and her alarm as unnecessary. What happens when the person who sees the danger has no power, and the person with power refuses to see it? Stéphanie returned to her apartments with no higher authority to approach. The future emperor continued moving through official life while the people around him adapted to his deterioration. Silence preserved the appearance of stability. It did nothing to make Rudolph stable. During these final months, Countess Marie Larisch, a niece of Empress Elizabeth and a member of Rudolph's circle, helped introduce him to Mary Vetsera. Mary was 17, socially ambitious and fascinated by the crown prince. The precise nature of what she understood or expected has been debated ever since. What is certain is that she entered a relationship with a married man whose behavior had become increasingly self-destructive. Stéphanie did not know Mary well. She was one more name among the women connected to her husband. Others at court became aware of the affair, while the wife again received information through avoidance, implication, and silence. By January of 1889, the marriage existed largely as an official performance. Rudolph and Stéphanie still attended public events together. They exchanged the required courtesies and maintained the image expected from a crown prince and crown princess. A photograph or newspaper report could still describe the couple without revealing that their shared life had almost disappeared. Late that month, Rudolph told Stéphanie that he was going to his hunting lodge at Mayerling, southwest of Vienna. He was expected to return for a family dinner. When he did not appear, the explanation sent back was ordinary. He had caught a cold and could not travel. Stéphanie repeated the message to the family. She had spent years relaying explanations for Rudolph's absences. A hunting trip that lasted longer than expected did not automatically signal disaster. Illness was plausible. No one at the table could know that the excuse would be the last message she delivered on her husband's behalf. On the morning of the 30th of January, Stéphanie began her usual activities. Her memoir describes a singing lesson interrupted when her chief lady-in-waiting entered with urgent news. Before the details were given, Stéphanie reportedly said, "He is dead." She was summoned to Franz Josef and Elizabeth. It was Empress Elizabeth who told her that Rudolph had been found dead at Mayerling. Mary Vetsera's body was beside him. Both had suffered gunshot wounds. The dominant historical account is that Rudolph shot Mary and then killed himself as part of an agreed death pact. The secrecy surrounding the immediate investigation, the removal of Mary's body, and the court's need to protect the dynasty created fertile ground for alternative theories. Claims of assassination and multiple attackers have persisted, but suspicion is not the same as proof. The broad documentary record continues to support murder, followed by suicide, even while some details remain contested. For the imperial family, the religious implications were immediate. Suicide was regarded by the Catholic Church as a mortal sin and could prevent burial in consecrated ground. Rudolph was heir to an empire whose authority remained closely connected to Catholic legitimacy. The court therefore emphasized that his mind had been disturbed at the moment of death, allowing a Catholic funeral in the imperial crypt. Mary Vetsera received no comparable protection. Her body was removed from Mayerling under secrecy and buried quickly. The official story centered on Rudolph's illness, tragedy, and dynastic importance. The teenage girl who died beside him became an inconvenience to be managed. Stéphanie was handed a farewell letter from her husband. Rudolph began by addressing her directly. He told her that she was freed from the torment of his presence and instructed her to be good to their poor little girl. He sent greetings to several acquaintances, wrote that death alone could save his good name, and ended with an expression of affection. The letter was not devoid of feeling toward Stéphanie. It used her name and was written specifically to her. But its emotional center remained Rudolph himself, his torment, his reputation, his decision, and the arrangements that would follow. Stéphanie was treated as the survivor, responsible for receiving instructions and caring for the child he left behind. There was no meaningful explanation of why he had imposed this scene upon her. No apology could make her widowhood private. No acknowledgement could protect her from the questions already spreading through Vienna. Even in farewell, Rudolph controlled the action while Stéphanie inherited the consequences. She was 24, her husband had died with a teenage mistress, and her only child had lost a father, while the imperial succession fell into uncertainty. Before Stéphanie could decide what the event meant to her, ministers, physicians, priests, and relatives were already deciding what it had to mean for the dynasty. In her memoir, she acknowledged that Rudolph's death released her from a marriage filled with anxiety and sorrow. But release came at a devastating price. The future for which she had endured the marriage was gone. She would never become empress. The public role used to justify her sacrifices had disappeared in one night. Then came blame. There is no reliable basis for saying that Empress Elizabeth sat before Stéphanie and directly accused her of causing Rudolph's death. The reality was more indirect and therefore harder to confront. Court society increasingly treated the failed marriage as part of Rudolph's despair. Stéphanie was judged to have lacked the warmth or emotional understanding her husband needed. The accusation protected several people at once. It reduced attention on Rudolph's affairs, illness, drug use, and violence, and it avoided any confrontation with Franz Joseph's refusal to recognize his son's deterioration. It also transformed an institutional and personal collapse into a story about a wife who had somehow failed to save the man harming her. What exactly was Stéphanie supposed to have done? She had entered the marriage at 16, performed the duties the court assigned her, and given birth to Rudolph's child. She had endured his affairs and suffered lasting physical consequences from his disease. She had even warned the emperor when Rudolph's decline became visible. Still, the wife remained the easiest surviving person to judge. At Rudolph's funeral, imperial ceremony covered the unanswered questions. Vienna watched the coffin of its crown prince pass through the city. Stéphanie appeared in mourning, required to embody dignified grief before people who knew her husband had died beside another woman. Mary's name was kept out of the official proceedings. This left Stéphanie as the principal woman visible within the public tragedy. Her daughter, Elizabeth Marie, was 5. The child could not understand the political calculations, religious decisions, or rumors surrounding her father's death. She knew only that he was gone, and her mother remained. For a time, the shared loss drew mother and daughter closer. Stéphanie wanted to leave Vienna. Going home to Belgium might have offered distance from Mayerling and the court's judgment, but widowhood did not restore her authority. Franz Joseph, as guardian of the young Elizabeth Marie, required that Stéphanie remain connected to Austria and her daughter's position. Leopold II also discouraged a retreat that might suggest public rupture or feed scandal. 2 royal fathers who had shaped the marriage now agreed that its widow must continue performing stability. Stéphanie was eventually permitted periods away, including time at Miramare. She traveled and lived more privately, avoiding a court in which her role had become uncertain. She retained the title of Dowager Crown Princess, but the future attached to it no longer existed. She was the widow of an heir who had never reigned. Empress Elizabeth withdrew as well. Rudolph's death shattered her, and she spent much of her remaining life in mourning and travel. The loss did not produce a durable closeness with Stéphanie. Their shared connection to Rudolph became another reason for distance rather than mutual comfort. For more than a decade, Stéphanie remained caught between identities. She was too important to disappear completely and no longer central to the succession. She had been trained to become empress, but now possessed no political destination. The court had not prepared a role for the young widow left behind by Mayerling. Then she met Count Elimer Lonier. He was a Hungarian aristocrat and diplomat, but he did not possess a royal throne or a rank equal to Stéphanie's birth. Their relationship developed outside the dynastic logic that had controlled her first marriage. No emperor needed the union, no government depended on it, and no one promised that marrying him would make her more powerful. That may have been its greatest attraction. Stéphanie was in her 30s, not 15. She knew what royal approval could cost and what a magnificent title could fail to provide. Elimer offered companionship that appeared quieter and more stable than the life she had known with Rudolph. By most accounts, their marriage would prove genuinely happy. Choosing him, nevertheless, carried serious consequences. A royal widow could not enter an unequal marriage without surrendering status. Franz Joseph reluctantly permitted the match, but Stéphanie would leave the imperial house and renounce the rank and privileges attached to her position. Her daughter remained in Vienna under the emperor's guardianship. On the 22nd of March, 1900, Stéphanie married Elimer at Miramar. The first wedding had been a European spectacle staged for 2 dynasties. The second was a personal decision that reduced rather than elevated her public standing. This time, she understood the exchange. Her father reacted with fury. Leopold II regarded the marriage as beneath her and cut his daughter off from the Belgian family. He considered withdrawing recognition and threatened financial consequences. Stéphanie had obeyed him when obedience delivered her to the Habsburgs. When she finally chose for herself, he treated that autonomy as betrayal. The conflict became especially painful after the death of Queen Marie Henriette in 1902. Stéphanie returned, hoping to pay her respects to her mother. Leopold barred her from attending the funeral service. Some later retellings transform the episode into a scene in which she was physically dragged away from the coffin, but the more defensible account is already severe enough. A daughter was denied participation in her mother's funeral because her father had not forgiven her marriage. There was no need to invent a removal from the chapel. Exclusion was the punishment. When Leopold himself approached death in 1909, Stéphanie was denied a final meeting with him. Afterward, she and her sisters discovered how extensively their father had arranged his fortune outside ordinary inheritance. Property and money were tied to trusts, projects, hidden holdings, and the interests of his former mistress. Stéphanie and Louise challenged the arrangements through prolonged legal disputes. It would be inaccurate to say Stéphanie received literally nothing. Financial settlements were eventually reached. But the daughters believed that a large part of their father's fortune had been deliberately placed beyond them, and litigation confirmed how thoroughly money had become another instrument in the family's conflict. The fortune itself carried a darker history. Leopold's wealth was more than the product of clever private business. It had been bound to the violent exploitation of the Congo. His daughter's claims concerned legal inheritance, but the money at the center of the dispute had been accumulated through a system that inflicted suffering far beyond Europe's royal households. Stéphanie settled with Elemer at Rusovce, then part of Hungary. Their home provided the stability that neither Brussels nor Vienna had given her. They managed the estate, created gardens, and received guests. In 1917, Elemer was elevated to princely rank, but the relationship had not begun as a strategy to obtain that distinction. She had finally chosen a man first and accepted the title later. There was, however, one relationship her second marriage did not repair. Elizabeth Marie regarded her mother's decision as abandonment. She had remained within the Habsburg world while Stéphanie left it. Mother and daughter became increasingly estranged, carrying different understandings of duty, love, and betrayal. Elizabeth had inherited more than a famous name. She had been born into the wreckage of a marriage and was 5 when Mayerling transformed her life. Franz Joseph took a strong role in her upbringing. The emperor who had dismissed Stéphanie's warning about Rudolph became the guardian of Rudolph's daughter. In 1902, Elizabeth married Prince Otto of Windisch-Gratz. The union produced 4 children, but became bitter and unstable. Like the women before her, Elizabeth discovered that an approved marriage could preserve rank while destroying private happiness. She later began a relationship with Leopold Petzneck, a social democratic politician, with none of the royal qualifications that had shaped her first marriage. Her politics moved sharply away from the world of her grandfather. She supported socialist causes, appeared at workers' events, and acquired the nickname the Red Archduchess. Stéphanie could have recognized the pattern. Her daughter was leaving an unhappy approved marriage and choosing a man the family considered unsuitable. Stéphanie herself had given up imperial rank to marry Elemer. She knew what it meant to value companionship over dynastic approval. Yet she did not extend the same understanding to Elizabeth. The reasons went beyond rank alone. Stéphanie disapproved of her daughter's long relationship outside marriage, her politics, and the wider disorder of her private life. Their disagreements became entangled with religion, property, and old resentments. Mother and daughter stopped seeing each other. By the final years of Stéphanie's life, the break was nearly complete. In 1944, Stéphanie made a will that disinherited Elizabeth and left her real property to the Benedictines. The child whom Rudolph's farewell letter had called the poor little one would receive no reconciliation from her mother. The woman who had condemned her father's rejection now used inheritance to express rejection of her own. This does not make Stéphanie identical to Leopold II. Her father's actions occurred within a much larger history of greed, coercion, and abuse. Stéphanie's conflict with Elizabeth had its own complicated circumstances. But the resemblance cannot be ignored. Both parents used access, recognition, and property to discipline a daughter who chose a life they would not accept. Surviving control had not taught Stéphanie how to release it. That is the most difficult part of her story because it prevents the comfortable conclusion that freedom automatically heals the person who wins it. Stéphanie escaped the role selected for her, found a love-in second marriage, and published her own account. Yet some of the rules she rejected remained inside her. The conviction that family dignity could justify exclusion, that an unsuitable love could make a daughter unworthy, and that inheritance could enforce obedience after conversation, had failed. The chain did not look the same in every generation. It still held. By the 1930s, the political world Stéphanie had once expected to enter had vanished. The Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed at the end of the First World War. The Habsburg throne ceased to exist. The promise that she would become empress no longer described a missed personal future alone. It described an abolished political order. Her memoir appeared inside that changed world. Publishing Rudolph's letter and her version of the marriage allowed Stéphanie to challenge decades of stories centered almost entirely on Mayerling's dead prince. But the book also produced legal conflict with Elizabeth, who objected to aspects of her mother's account. Even authorship became another battlefield between them. Then Europe entered another war. Rudolph was drawn into military occupation. German forces took over much of the residence and examined or removed documents. Stéphanie and Eleanor were restricted within their own home. The palace in which they had built a quieter life became valuable to armed men whose authority neither owner could resist. In April of 1945, the Red Army reached the estate. Stéphanie and Eleanor initially remained, then left for the Benedictine Archabbey of Pannonhalma, which was under the protection of the International Committee of the Red Cross. She was 80, in poor health, and once again being displaced by forces larger than herself. She would never return to Rudolph. On the 23rd of August, 1945, Princess Stéphanie of Belgium died at Pannonhalma after suffering a stroke. She was 81. Elizabeth was not at the funeral, nor were Stéphanie's other descendants. Eleanor survived her by less than a year and was later buried beside her. The placement mattered. Stéphanie did not rest beside Crown Prince Rudolph, the husband selected when she was 15, and the man whose death had defined her public identity. She was buried beside Eleanor Launier. The husband she had chosen after the imperial future disappeared. That choice offers a form of resolution, but not absolution. Stéphanie found personal happiness without repairing the relationship with her daughter. she escaped one golden cage while preserving some of its rules. She became both the young woman denied a voice and the mother who refused to hear a choice she could not approve. The wedding veil followed a different journey. It outlived Leopold, Marie Henriette, Cece, Franz Joseph, Rudolph, Stephanie, and the empire that had arranged the marriage. It crossed into private ownership and eventually entered the collection of Marjorie Merriweather Post. Today, it is preserved at Hillwood, outside Washington. Visitors can examine the workmanship without knowing the life of the girl who wore it. The lace still performs the purpose for which it was created. It looks delicate while holding its shape. It remains beautiful because every thread stays where it was placed. Stephanie was expected to do the same. For much of her life, she obeyed. Then she pulled herself free. The tragedy is that she never entirely stopped believing that a daughter's place should still be chosen for her,